a campaign of violence against its black rivals so that it could gain untrammeled control over the new South Africa.
Right. So we're here with the amazing Dr. Anthea Jeffery, who is the head of policy research at the Institute of Race Relations, IRR, and who's here to promote her latest book, Countdown to Socialism, which I can't wait to ask her about. I read it. It's amazing. Like all her books, always gives you an honest and straight look at South Africa. So yeah, Anthea, welcome. I think this is your third time on WorldView. For our viewers, we've spoken about the NDR a few times, but for our viewers, what would be a brief summary of the National Democratic Revolution?
Morning, Donald, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about it. Well, the National Democratic Revolution, or the NDR, is a strategy that was developed by the Soviet Union in the 1950s with the idea that it could be used to take a predominantly capitalist country to socialism and ultimately to communism via a series of incremental steps that increasingly would sort of cripple the capitalist economy and bring the country to a point where a socialist alternative seemed a viable and good thing to do. So the ANC and the SACP both endorsed the NDR in the 1960s, despite the disbandment of the Soviet Union in 1991, and I think the world's general feeling that socialism had failed. That's not how the ANC-SACP alliance has seen it. Instead, they continue to seek socialism as the goal, and they regard the NDR as providing the most direct route to get there. And what they're trying to do with the NDR, if one can really try and bring it together in a nutshell, is always to expand the control, often the ownership of the state, and at the same time to roll back the capitalist market so that people increasingly become dependent on the state for all their core needs. At the moment, we have state provision, or at least some involvement in things like education, healthcare, transport, pensions, life insurance, a whole number of sectors. There's a private sector role. And the idea is that in each of them, the private sector should cease to provide, that all provisions should be taken over by the state instead, that people will then be thoroughly dependent on the state, and they will also be de-linked from the capitalist economy just to entrench that dependence. And in this situation, a relatively small elite can acquire an extraordinary degree of power, something I think is quite difficult to imagine from where we are in a still predominantly capitalist society, just how great the power of the state becomes when it's the main employer, the main landlord, the main banker, the main everything. And at the same time, that small elite also becomes enormously wealthy because there are so many resources that are now under their control and into which they can dip for their own personal benefit.
Welcome back. Today we've got something special to share. Join our community and support our mission. WorldView believes in elevating intelligent debate in an entertaining way. With over 200 interviews, documentaries and debates, 3 million views and 150,000 unique viewers monthly, we've made an impact. However, creating content takes resources. Please consider supporting us with a super thanks on our videos. Every bit helps. Want to promote your business? Advertise with us. Contact us through the email below. We believe in genuine partnerships. Catch behind the scenes on Twitter and Facebook. Links are in the description. Let's stay connected. To all our supporters, we couldn't have gotten this far without you. Your support means the world to us. Like, share and subscribe and hit the bell for more. Now, back to the interview. And one of the primary vehicles you lay out in your book for the creation or encouragement of a national democratic revolution was the United Democratic Front, the UDF. Do you think the senior members of the UDF, people like Alan Boesak, do you think they were aware of the NDR?
Yes, I do think so, very much so. If you look at Jeremy Seeking's book on the UDF, he says that 24 of the 25 members of the UDF's National Executive Committee were all members of the ANC underground, closet, of course, because the ANC was banned at that time, but nevertheless part of the ANC, privy to all its goals, including the two-stage revolution, the first for national liberation by taking control of the new South Africa, and the second, the the more incremental stage of moving via the NDR to socialism. And there was an internal UDF document drawn up by Arnold Stofile in which they said that the ultimate objective of the UDF was to liberate South Africans from the sort of voracious monster that is capitalism, but that this could not be disclosed to people because most South Africans were pragmatic and it would limit the support that the UDF could gain.
That's interesting. So essentially, to summarize it and to simplify it, the senior leaders of the UDF were essentially communists.
They certainly shared the socialist end goal. Yes.
Interesting. So, fast forwarding a bit. So there was an accusation during the CODESA talks of a third force that the government was responsible, or the state was responsible for funding the IFP to seek vengeful attacks against the ANC. But you lay out in your book that's actually, not only is there no real evidence for that, it's actually very implausible for two reasons. Can you give our viewers those two reasons why it would actually be very implausible for the state to fund the IFP to go after Inkatha, not the IFP, I think at that point in time?
Actually, the period that you're talking about, the negotiations period from 1990 to 1994, that was when the violence was most intense, when we had 15,000 deaths as opposed to the 5,500 that had happened in the 1980s. And at that point, Inkatha had changed into the Inkatha Freedom Party, or the IFP, which it did in July 1990. And why I think the third force theory is implausible is, first of all, because it ignores the ANC's People's War. The ANC had gone to Vietnam in 1978, embraced a strategy of People's War thereafter via the Green Book, Lessons from Vietnam, was determined to implement this very multifaceted strategy, which had at its core a campaign of violence against its black rivals so that it could gain untrammeled control over the new South Africa. So the third force theory, first of all, ignores that and the fact that the ANC was continuing with the People's War even during the negotiations period. And with the help of the 13,000 Umkhonto cadres, it had been able to bring back into the country under the cover of the negotiations process, and whom it then refused to disband or disarm. So with all those fighters now available to it and this upsurge in violence, you had to explain it. And you had to do it in a way that deflected blame from the ANC and put it elsewhere. And who else to put it on but the IFP and the police? And there were, of course, incidents which seemed to lend itself to a third force interpretation. And the Patong Massacre was perhaps the best known of those. That took place in June 1992, when the IFP attacked the sleeping township of Patong and killed 45 people, including women and children. And the ANC alleged that the police had helped them, that this was a classic example of the third force at work, and they broke off negotiations, etc. But when the matter came to trial in 1993, 120 or so residents of Patong gave evidence in the trial, and all of them testified to the IFP having acted on its own without police help. There were one or two that said the opposite, but their testimony was discredited under cross-examination. So the trial judge concluded there had been no police role. This was simply an Inkatha revenge raid, because all the people who had carried it out were refugees from ANC violence. They'd been pushed out of their homes and hostels on the reef. They'd taken refuge in KwaModala, the old place, a disused Isco hostel, and yet they were still being attacked. And on the 16th, of June, which was the day before the Patong Massacre, 3 IFP supporters were necklaced. And that was the final straw, which precipitated the raid the next evening and all those deaths. But it was not a third force attack. It was an IFP revenge raid.
What's
and then the other, sorry, if I can take a glass of water.
No problem.
Carry on with the other sort of huge implausibility about it, is that overall, about 400 IFP leaders were killed from 1985 through to 1994, which is a lot. And thousands of IFP supporters were killed too. And many of them, the bulk, were killed in premeditated attacks, often shot to death, sometimes burnt by the necklace method. And at the same time, there were 1,000 police deaths from 1990 to 1994. There were 1,700 police officers who were injured in a 6-month period in 1993. And it's inconceivable that a third force would attack and injure so many of its own. You can imagine a third force wanting to kill and attack some of its own supporters in order to stir up tensions and provoke conflict, and then use this supposedly to try and derail negotiations. But a third force that killed and attacked so many of its own supporters simply makes no sense.
So, I mean, if it was a third force, one, there's no real evidence for it, and two, even if there was evidence, they did a terrible job at it.
They did do a terrible job. They killed so many of their own, and in addition, they got nothing from it. Yeah. Because every attack that took place that could be painted as a third force attack further discredited Buthelezi, further discredited de Klerk, further boosted the ANC. Whereas the ANC's own violence passed unremarked, and it was able, as Joe Slovo said, to win a famous victory in the negotiations. And that victory would not have been possible, as Joe Slovo said, without it using negotiations as a terrain of struggle, without it combining negotiations with violence. And so it was the ANC that gained from the violence, not anybody else.
The IFP were eventually coerced or encouraged to join the election in 1994 with a sort of a deal, a promise on federalism. But the ANC essentially didn't follow through on that promise. Can you tell our viewers on that? I think Buthelezi actually described the final constitution as an Orwellian document.
Yes, indeed. The birth certificate of an Orwellian society, he said, and I think we can see increasingly how that is accurate. Yeah, the federalism issue was something that many parties felt strongly about. The IFP wanted a federal constitution, so did the National Party. So, in fact, did 10 of the other 18 parties to CODESA, enough to outvote the ANC. So it was partly in order to prevent the ANC being converted that it was using violence and as an adjunct to negotiations to strengthen its hand, to weaken its opponents. And in the end, it got its famous victory in the talks, which included a highly centralized constitution. And in response to that, the IFP withdrew from the negotiations. And though it was dismissed as nothing but a spoiler, Buthelezi was essentially saying two things. We've had no say whatsoever in this negotiated settlement, so-called, which has been drawn up really to suit the ANC. And secondly, we have so many of our people being shot for belonging to the wrong political party. It's not an atmosphere that's conducive either to negotiations or a fair election. But a week before the election, the IFP was persuaded to come in and participate in the election after all by an ANC promise that it would engage in international mediation as soon as possible after the election on all outstanding issues, which would have included the federalism one. And based on that promise, the IFP came in, did take part. But when the Constituent Assembly began to sit after the election and to negotiate on the terms of the final constitution, the ANC simply refused to have anything to do with international mediation. It reneged on that promise, and it was, in a way, sort of quietly allowed to do so because there was no great condemnation of its behavior. It was possible for it to renege on its promise to a discredited Inkatha with considerable impunity.
Yeah, out of interest's sake, why do you think the IFP did agree to that? Because the ANC did not seem like a very reliable partner. And perhaps the reason, and I think you spoke about it in the previous book, is that essentially Buthelezi feared for his life. There was an academic, some professor that from Africa, one of the other African states, who told him, listen, you either participate in this election or you're perhaps not going to survive. Do you think essentially that's what it boils down to?
Not only Buthelezi, but indeed 400 IFP leaders by then are already dead. And what had also happened was that the ANC, or through the transitional body, which was dominated by the ANC, the Transitional Executive Council, had got to declare a state of emergency in KwaZulu-Natal. So that state of emergency already applied before the election and during the election. And it meant that Inkatha leaders were already also vulnerable to being detained. And of course, the violence had seen many of them taken out already. And there was indeed this pressure from Okuma, I think his name was. I'm sorry that I feel vague on it at this point. But he was trying to get an agreement between the ANC and the IFP. And he did engage in what he called very straight talking to the IFP to warn them that once the election had taken place, the ANC had won control without the IFP even contesting the poll. It would be that much easier for them to use their state power to further weaken and attack the IFP, partially under the cover of emergency rule.